This is Beyond the Pale podcast. This is week 2. I am your co-host, Laura Maclntyre.
And I'm Keishaun Wade, and today we'll be discussing Project 2025.
Make sure you talk loud, because
hopefully I'm talking loud enough for everyone to hear, but we'll be discussing Project 2025, its importance and impact potentially on Flint, and kind of giving an overview of the project a little bit. With us today, we have members of DDL, Claire McClinton, and Bethany Hazard.
the Democracy Defense League.
Yes.
Sorry,
It's okay.
nobody called me.
Okay, and so we're gonna kick off the podcast with Claire McClinton, Bethany Hazard of the Democracy Defense League. We just thought we would just jump right into it, looking at there's over 900 pages of Project 2025, but don't let that intimidate you at all. I think there was some influencer who said it's 900 pages, but it can all be summed up in like 15 words. Because honestly, it's a lot of verbiage, it's a lot of words that says not a lot of nothing, but the impact is powerful. And if we don't pay attention, then it's going to have a huge impact on our life. So we're going to start with the first 3 pages, which is the introduction, because it kind of gives you a taste and the overall flavor of what's to come, or what's in the pipe, so to speak.
Right. So we'll start off with reading the foreword, and I first want to thank everybody for participating, either if that's watching this back, if you're watching this live, or if you're here in person with us. These are really, really important conversations for us to be having, especially as it pertains to beginning to understand what we're up against. Even if Project 2025 isn't enacted in its full composition as we know it now, we do know that there are people who want these things to happen in our country. So therefore, they are an ever-present threat. So we kind of need to begin on a foundation of understanding this threat and having knowledge of this threat if we're to do anything to resist it and build other systems and other ways of being and ways of knowing outside of that. So,
and also, I just wanted to interject that these aren't new ideas. They've been out there for decades. This is just the latest incarnation of these terribly retrogressive, basically fascist ideas. And so this is the latest form. And so we're also going to be making key connections to some of the things in the past where they've popped up. And, just kind of, your history, you can, help make sure that you don't repeat it. So that's kind of our agenda with this podcast.
right. So we'll first get into reading a little bit of the foreword. I'm going to pull it up on the larger screen. Hopefully you guys can see that well. All right, so this is the beginning of the foreword. And it starts off, it's written by Kevin Roberts, and it starts off a promise to America. So I'll just get straight into it. 44 years ago, the United States and the conservative movement were in dire straits. Both had been betrayed by the Washington establishment and were uncertain whom to trust. Both were internally splintered and strategically adrift. Worse still, at that moment of acute vulnerability and division, we found ourselves besieged by existential adversaries, foreign and domestic. The late 1970s were, by any measure, a historic low point for America and the political coalition dedicated to preserving its unique legacy of human flourishing and freedom. Today, America and the conservative movement are enduring an era of division and danger akin to the late 1970s. Now, as then, our political class has been discredited by a wholesale dishonesty and corruption. Look at America under the ruling by cultural elite today. Inflation is ravaging family budgets, drug overdose deaths continue to escalate, and children suffer the toxic normalization of transgenderism with drag queens and pornography invading their school libraries. Overseas, a totalitarian communist dictatorship in Beijing is engaged in a strategic, cultural, and economic Cold War against America's interests, values, and people, all while globalist elites in Washington awaken only slowly to that growing threat. Moreover, low income communities are drowning in addiction and government dependence. Contemporary elites have even repurposed the worst ingredients of 1970s radical chic to build the totalitarian cult known today as the Great Awakening. And now, as then, the Republican Party seems to have little understanding about what to do. Most alarming of all, the very moral foundations of our society are in peril. Yet students of history will know that notwithstanding all of those changes, the late 1970s proved to be the moment when the political right unified itself and the country unified the country and led the United States to historic political, economic, and global victories.
Okay, let's pause there, because that's a lot. It's a lot of mouthfuls, but that's kind of what we wanted to underscore. Is this is not new. The late 70s, going into the 80s, there are some key moments that were designed and put in place on purpose, and that we're dealing with the consequences today. And kind of the perspective of Beyond the Pale is that Keishaun and I have a good relationship, a good interaction, and we have very different perspectives, but we come around to the same place. And so this is a way of kind of having that dialogue between, different generations, different races, and highlighting some of the important things that need to be highlighted today. So, like, for example, in the late 1970s, in the 1980s, I was in high school, and I was just coming to political consciousness. And I remember when Ronald Reagan was running for office and actually got elected. And today we think nothing of it, but at the time it was unprecedented. He was an actor out of Hollywood. There was no way in the world an actor out of Hollywood was going to become president of the United States. Fast forward to today, we actually have a reality star, television star, Donald Trump, as the president, and nobody blinks an eye, to be quite honest. If in 1980 you'd said Donald Trump was going to be president, it would have seemed like an alternative reality, out of the Twilight Zone. Even a couple of years before, when Jimmy Carter was running for president, everyone was like, there's no way a peanut farmer from Georgia can be president. The political times have drastically changed. And then this president, this Hollywood actor, Ronald Reagan, started off his tenure by declaring the air traffic controllers went on strike, and he ordered them back to work. And at that time, that was just shocking. And maybe Mother Claire can speak to that, because that we said at the time, this is the beginning of the end of the labor movement in the 80s. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had a lot of adversity in the 30s, in the 20s and the 30s, which definitely shifted the way the labor movement was going. But this breaking of the air traffic controllers union in 81, 83, was pivotal, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But I just wanted to kind of bring that up because when everyone talks about Project 2025 as being something new and something contemporary, yes, it is, but it also has its foundation and its roots into some very specific things that were happening. And it's quite shocking to me because I was so young when it all happened. And we remember saying, oh no, if this happens 30 years from now, 40 years from now, we're going to be in a world of hurt and a world of trouble, and yet, and here we are. So, I just kind of wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, excellent point.
So I'll finish a little bit of this next part, and then I'll have Laura comment on something specifically that is in this part of the foreword. They're using language that is very kind of specific to the history of Flint and very instrumental in the total history of Flint, something that Andrew Highsmith talked about in his book Demolition Needs Progress, which we talked a little bit about last week. But yeah, so I'll have Laura comment on that a little bit after I read this part. So they go on to say, the Heritage Foundation is proud to have played a small but pivotal role in that story. It was early 1979 amid stagflation, gas launch, and the Red Army's invasion of Afghanistan, the nadir of Jimmy Carter's days of malaise, that the malaise, that the Heritage launched the Mandate for Leadership project. We brought together hundreds of conservative scholars and academics across the conservative movement. Together, this team created a 20-volume, 3,000-page governing handbook containing more than 2,000 conservative policies to reform the federal government and rescue the American people from Washington dysfunction. It was a promise from the conservative movement to the country, confident, specific, and clear.
Okay, so let's take a deep breath and kind of start breaking this down because, again, this gets back to what I was talking about. 1979. Okay. About to see Ronald Reagan come into power. And at the same time, you have the Heritage Foundation in this report admitting to what we knew, we're experiencing, we were warning people about in 1979, mind you, that this was going to be the turn of the Conservative Party. Now, let's not make a mistake. We're talking about a conservative movement. We're not talking about Democrats and Republicans. Because, as Noam Chomsky says, they're two sides to the same coin, right? Democrats, Republicans. It's an ideology. It's a way of thinking about power and structuring society. It's not that you have left wing and right wing, you have conservative and liberal. Those are social constructions. That's propaganda meant to confuse us and to sidetrack us. Because don't forget, a few years later, after Reagan, came Clinton, and he repealed Glass-Steagall. And he was a Democrat. And I'll explain, we'll talk about that in more depth later, but that is something to bear in mind, that you have Democrats and Republicans pushing this conservative agenda. So it's not about political parties. It's about a political machine and of power and of wealth, right? Donald Trump was friends with the Clintons. And was a quote unquote Democrat at one point. So we're looking at power structures. We're not looking at Republicans, Democrats, and that kind of thing. If anyone else wants to chime in.
No, I think you all are on track.
And I want to just add a little bit of context to this as well, because we're talking about a wave of conservative resurgence and a wave of conservative action that is a reaction to things that had went on in the 60s, like the Civil Rights Act, things like the 1968 Fair Housing Act that started right here in Flint. So these are leading to these hyper-conservative actions being taken and these groups of people getting together to react to those actions taken the decade past. So something that Andrew Heisman talked about in Demolition Needs Progress, specifically in reaction, kind of this conservative movement that was happening right here in Flint, that happened right after the 1968 Housing Act, was that the federal government had to come in to Flint in 1976 to place a desegregation order onto the Flint schools, the Flint public schools, because they had been accused of and participating in administrative segregation to preserve segregations in Flint schools that had allowed them the amount of success and white participation that they had seen. I think a figure from that time period was that I think in either 1967 or 1968, the year before the Housing Act, Flint Public Schools had reached a height of 47,000 children in the public schools. And immediately after the Housing Act was signed and placed on the Fair Housing Act was signed and placed into law, school participation dropped immediately after. From 1968 till 1980, it was the largest drop in the Flint schools ever.
So
Historically ever.
remember that housing is inextricably linked to education because you go to school where you live, based on where you live. And the schools were segregated specifically using the tools of redlining, insurance redlining, residential redlining. And so when the Housing Act was passed, it terrified white people because it meant that you would have fair housing, and fair housing meant fair schools. And so then you have Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which everyone was just ignoring as if it didn't even happen, right? With all deliberate speed, my ass. I shouldn't say that, but it wasn't very speedy. And by the time the 70s rolled around, then the federal government looked at school systems and looked at housing and said, you're still segregated, and it's been since 1954. And if you don't desegregate, we're going to take away your federal funding. At which point, we had desegregation, but then we also had, we'll get back to some of these things that were happening in Project 2025, some reactions to those federal mandates, because there are certain groups, and the conservative movement certainly was not going to desegregate the schools and desegregate the housing, right? There was going to be a counteraction to this, and some of this was in response to those mandates and to those changes that had been effected. And joining us now is another Democracy Defense League member, Joyce Ellis McNeil, who's the president of the school board. So we're kind of talking about some of these things, and here she is. Good to have you. We're kind of in the thick of things, so to speak. We've just been going over the introduction to Project 2025 and explaining its link to the past and why it's important to know that moving forward, so that we can be proactive in our responses to it, not just reactive and reactionary.
Right. So I'll finish reading this, and then we'll go over some of the main tenets of the conservative promise that they're kind of defining. So, yeah. So I left off on Mandate for Leadership was
The
published.
Heritage Foundation, to the one above it. The Heritage Foundation is proud to have played a small
I
but pivotal
read
role.
that.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
Oh, senior moment. Sorry, Keishaun.
Mandate for Leadership was published in January 1981, the same month Ronald Reagan was sworn into his presidency. By the end of that year, more than 60% of its recommendations had become policy, and Reagan was on his way to ending stagflation, reviving American confidence and prosperity, and winning the Cold War. The bad news today is our political establishment and cultural elite have once again driven America towards decline. The good news is that we know the way out, even through the challenges today, are not what they were in the 70s. Conservatives should be confident that we can rescue our kids, reclaim our culture, revive our economy, and defeat the anti-American left at home and abroad. We did it before and we will do it again. As Ronald Reagan put it, freedom is a fragile thing and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation. This is the duty history has put before us and the standard by which our generation of conservatives will be judged, and we should not want it any other way. The legacy of Mandate for Leadership, and indeed of the entire Reagan revolution, is that if conservatives want to save the country, we need a bold and courageous plan. This book is the first step in that plan. So, a little bit more about the conservative promise. It has 4 main bold points. So, the first one is to restore the family as a centerpiece of American life and protect our children. The second is to dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to American people. The third is to defend our nation's sovereignties, borders, and bounty against global threats. And the fourth, final, is to secure our God-given individual rights to live freely, and they define that as what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. So if we could just respond to those things, it's using language that has connotations based in morality and good things, but that is not what it actually means at all.
That's right.
It's weaponizing these words and this language in a way to appeal to people's ethical considerations, but in fact, it's hiding something a little bit deeper and more sinister. I'll let you talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mentioned Noam Chomsky before, and it's part of the manufacturing of consent, where you kind of repeat some phrases and words over and over again, and they mean one particular thing, but they actually aren't meaning the very thing that they're articulating. And we'll be talking about that, in another podcast. But I think it's important that what you highlight is that you have a lot of seemingly different sources saying the same thing. So it's manufacturing consent, making it seem as if everybody is saying this, everybody believes this, and yet it's something that is being purposely constructed and disseminated to all of us. The Heritage Foundation, let's take a step back, is a conservative think tank that is founded with millions, if not billions of dollars over the decades.
And if I could just add, the budget for this project 2025 was $22 million.
Oh my God.
Right. So all accumulated, there is a lot of dark money that is being spent manufacturing this consent and creating this agenda. And it's a really good question to ask, who is funding this and who is coming up with the ideas behind this? Now, we're not necessarily here to give all the answers to that, because we frankly, we don't know all of the answers, but we're very concerned about those questions. And the Heritage Foundation, like I said, is a conservative think tank. It is well orchestrated, well funded, well organized, and that's who our adversary is. And so this is kind of a call to all of us. We may not be well funded, but we can get better organized, and we have the power of the people. We've always had that, of collective action. We have several union members here, several union leaders who understand the power of that, and have actually, they're leaders and pillars in our community. And so that's why we're sitting here today with hundreds of years of knowledge right here in this very room. And we're calling on people to come together in a calculated, guided way so that we're not just reacting to Project 2025, but we're actually proposing a way forward. And it's not like we have to come up with something new. We've been organizing and collectively acting on these things since the 70s, if not even earlier. I don't want to call out names, but I mean, we have some wildcat strikers here, or maybe not that far back, but we've got some institutional memory in this room, some very powerful memory that we would be remiss to ignore. We can learn from our elders and from our ancestors. Absolutely. We have movements that, while they may not have been completely successful on the outside, have given us a lot of tools and a lot of things to draw our strength from. So it's not as if we haven't been resisting this all along, but right now we need to maybe go back to some of those strategies and organize them in a new way to counter this new Project 2025.
Yeah, so now I think it's important for us to kind of talk about the rest of Project 2025 and kind of give a summary as to what are the main things trying to be accomplished by Project 2025. And basically, it's broken up into 5 sections. The first section being taking the reins of government, which basically mean kind of centralizing power into one authoritative person, the president. So kind of like creating an authoritarian government that is controlled by white nationalist ethos, or people who believe in these Christian nationalist values. So the section really talks about the need to deconstruct kind of the system that we already have now, which is this kind of centralized administrative state, and placing more authority and more power in the hands of these political appointees that, one figurehead is choosing and directing to do. So basically a dictatorship, the exact opposite of democracy and the idea of sovereignty and governing for yourself and choosing people to act out the will of the people. It's really acting out the will of specific groups of individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's point out the fact that it's called the Heritage Foundation. Again, the manufacturing of consent, because this is not our heritage. Our heritage is not and should not be totalitarianism and fascism. And an antithesis to democracy, right? Now, our democratic process has been a little rough. It has been violent at times. It has been very messy at times, but it's a lot better than totalitarianism. And the ideal of democracy is still something to strive for, not to completely eliminate. So this project, when it's calling for taking the reins of government, is basically eliminating all of the democracy and the democratic movement that has existed before now. So it's just something to think about. We also wanted to, give room. I think you said that you wanted to have a more of a conversation, and I just feel like we're just bulldozing with
Going through it, so
with-
people know
okay.
what it is first.
Right.
Okay, yeah, but if something sticks out, or maybe make a little note so that we can, come back to some of these things. And I apologize that we can't see the questions right now. If there are any questions or comments that people have, we will definitely make note of those and address those at a later point. So the second one is the common defense. And Keishaun, do you want to say a couple of words about the second precept?
Yeah, so the second section of the Project 2025, the common defense, is addressing how we as a nation are basically our foreign policy, and funding forever wars, and kind of streamlining, I guess, their vision for streamlining the process and the bureaucracy of those specific entities that might be able to guide our national defense plan. So they talk about the Department of Defense a lot, and talk about the threat nations or countries like China has to the U.S. And this all culminates in a call for robust missile defense systems and more advanced technologies to counter different countries like China and stuff like that. So basically, placing more and more money in the hands of our military instead of things that the country needs, social programs and different things like that.
Food, healthcare, shelter, being kind to one another. And remember, Dwight D. Eisenhower, way back in the day, warned us
All right.
about the impending, and he coined the term, military industrial complex. And what I find so astonishing is that even though this is a historical moment, right, where you have this fairly conservative president, mind you, who was a military leader, saying, hey, wait a minute, I don't like what I see. I don't like how I see the economy, the military, and the government converging in a very particular modern way that is new, that kind of frightens me a little bit, even as a military leader. And we need to be careful about what he saw and what he termed the military industrial complex. About, as Keishaun was talking about, these forever wars. They're not just battles of good versus evil where something needs to be overcome and the moment is over. These are perpetual war. And as I'm an academic, I love theory. Paul Virilio in Silver l'Étranger calls it total war. We are now living in a modern society of total, it's just war. all the time, everywhere, all at once. And it's become normalized. And this is something Eisenhower was warning about. And people don't even blink an eye when you say military industrial complex. It's like, oh yeah, there it is. It's like, no, wait a minute. It's not there it is. It's we don't have to accept this. We can say no. We can take some of the funds that go into so-called defense, which isn't really defending us, which is actually putting us more at risk and making us more vulnerable, and put it into things that would actually defend us. We are a better people when we have enough to eat, when we have a place to live, when we are safe, when we are not in such desperate circumstances that we're killing one another and raising children to be in places of vulnerability and insecurity. And then later we're going to talk about the connection to Palestine, and I mean, because when you start talking about military industrial complex with G4 and Halliburton, it gets very frightening and insidious, and there is a connection to the Heritage Foundation with some of these things.
So we're going to move on to section 3, which is the general welfare. And this section is starting off, well, we talked a little bit about this before with the 4 broad points that's in the foreword, specifically the restoring family as a centerpiece of American life and protecting our children. This section says that they are trying to support American families. And they start off with redefining sex. So critiquing definitions of sex that are more inclusive to gender diverse people. And they are they're using that as a political tool to garner support for kind of the ways in which we kind of have biases against gender diverse people. Other parts of this include COVID-19 policies, so kind of going against mask mandates in healthcare settings, and making it so that vaccinations and vaccine mandates are rendered useless. They go in a little bit more with programs like the temporary assistance for needy families, and they propose reforming it so that it increases work engagement and support for low-income families, which ultimately, and I think a lot of people have been talking more about this part on Facebook a little bit, restructuring kind of how labor exists now, the 40-hour work week, and getting paid overtime for going over 40 hours, kind of reorganizing that in a way that favors employers and larger corporations to steal labor from people in a way that they won't have to compensate them for doing that. So that, to me, signals that part of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF program, it signals that. They call for eliminating Head Start programs. And there's another one that calls for reforming healthcare programs and supporting healthcare programs that better support American families.
So there is a lot to unpack here, because to be sure, we do need better health care, but we need better health care moving towards actually taking care of the public's health as opposed to eliminating public health, right? There's so much to unpack here, because this focuses more on the needs of the individual as opposed to the needs of the community. And yet it's using the rhetoric and the words of democracy and of cooperation and unity in a very antithetical way. It's very much 1984 doublespeak, where the word good means, double good and bad. It means the actual opposite of what you're saying. I love how when I was little, we were taught the preamble to the Constitution. Does everyone remember that? And we would do Schoolhouse Rock, and we would all sing, promote the common defense, promote the general welfare. And you recognize where these words are coming from? They're taking them out of the Constitution. They're taking them out of what our so-called founding fathers wrote and thought about, but in such a way that they just twist them around and turn them on their head. Which, when you've systematically eliminated and dismantled education for decades and decades, is going to be easier to do when people don't know what the preamble to the Constitution is, don't know the Constitution, and are relying on a conservative think tank to tell them what it means because they don't have the faculty of critical thinking, because we've been stripped of our education for years and years and years. So there is a lot, and we want to be able to take this apart in an intentional way so that we can provide an alternative, not to overwhelm everybody, and not to, ignore parts of it that need to be talked about more than others.
Right.
So see what we've got. We're at 4:23. So we wanted to open up just this discussion, this podcast with this is our goal, this is our vision. It's a lot to tackle in an hour each week, but we're committed to doing this every Wednesday at 3:30 for however long it takes. I'm assuming at least up until the election, and community work is never ending work. And social justice work, as George Lipson says, is like being in a relationship with someone who doesn't love you back. So here we are. We're gonna have to wrap it up in a little bit, and
I believe we've got about 15 more minutes.
Yeah.
But on the screen, I've included different examples of kind of specific things that are ending or being reorganized. So there are some examples from each section that kind of illustrate exactly what the changes of these things are ending. So we just talked about section 3, the general welfare, that's kind of focusing on the traditional family element. So the first one, in no-fault divorce, that is an example of that. The ban of contraceptives, that is an example of that. Cutting Social Security, that is an example. Cut Medicare, that is an example. In the Affordable Care Act, that is an example. So these are just different things that illustrate what their idea of protecting the traditional family is. This is how they
protecting the family.
Yes, this is how they think of protecting the family. So really,
I don't think they really think that this is
what they're labeling it as.
This is right. These are the words they're putting to these particular agendas.
Right.
And it's under the propaganda of protecting the family. Make no
That
mistake.
doesn't mean it sounds.
Exactly. They're not protecting the family
No.
in any way, shape, or form. But this is the language that is being
Increased
used.
Arctic drilling. How's that protecting the family?
Keishaun, did you want to read a few more of those?
Yeah.
Oh,
Bullet
sorry.
points? Yeah, just in case people can't see it.
Yeah, so teach Christian religious beliefs in public schools.
What?
That is an example of protecting the family, and kind of eliminating the separation of church and state, which is central to U.S. democracy,
Yes.
kind of the principles that got us as a country in the first place. Won't get into that too much,
Even
but
though we were founded on genocide and
and
slavery.
but
Yeah.
so a few more, I guess. I'll do two more. Condemn single mothers while promoting only traditional families. That is included in that. And
I would hurt a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I can hardly see this.
Mass deportation
Yes.
of immigrants.
Well,
Geez, I'm an immigrant.
I think that might be independent regulatory agencies.
Oh, so you're not at
Yeah.
that part
Yeah.
yet. Okay.
But
I guess we're all gonna have to leave then, since
We're all,
We're all
my
immigrants.
family's, aren't we all immigrants?
All of us.
so yeah, those are examples of Section 3.
Okay.
So I guess now maybe we could move on to Section 4. Did we have any comments or things that people want to say or highlight?
When I heard about the project 2025, and I heard some of the bullet points, I thought about the emergency manager system,
Oh, yeah.
where they take away your democracy. If we get a dictator in that position as president, we're all in trouble. His agenda will be met. He won't be looking out for us. He'll be looking out for the 1% that he's always looked out for. That's one major thing. So, and the education, dismantling the education is crucial. We cannot afford Project 2025. They're already decimating public education. And it's just a few of us on the school board that are fighting to maintain and rebuild and reorganize and restore and rejuvenate. And that's the reason we still have a semblance of public schools right now. That's not including the gentrification, moving us out of our homes.
Yes.
All of this stuff comes into play under 2025. You don't want it and you don't need it.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be clear and we have to speak clear where you can understand it. Some of you don't understand it. So it's people like us that fight. I'm a union rep at the highest level. I've led more strikes in this community fighting for the rights of you, everyday people. If they had their way, you wouldn't get anything. You do what they tell you. The 40-hour work we fought for. We fought for the overtime. They're going to dismantle all of the rights that we've accomplished in the past. And so therefore, we fight for you. Some of you don't know how to speak about it. You don't understand it. And that's why we're in places as activists. And we're going to continue to fight for you, for us, for our communities. So be clear. Listen to this Project 2025 and understand it. And if you don't understand it, ask the questions. But we're clear. We do not need another dictatorship like with the emergency manager that poisoned this entire city.
And before this podcast was starting, when we were having a discussion to go over what we were going to talk about, Mama Claire brought up the emergency manager as well. And that is something that we are definitely going to be talking about in weeks to come. We all know what it is in Michigan. We especially know what it is in Flint and cities like Benton Harbor and Pontiac and Ecorse, and the list goes on and on and on. And one thing that strikes me particularly is that Mama Claire said that this was the emergency manager is like Project 2025 is establishing a federal emergency manager.
Exactly.
And we saw how disastrous an emergency manager was to the city of Flint, with a city going on 10 years of a water crisis. And so that's that connection that we need to, as Flintstones, we're here to tell you we're survivors, but it's not good. It's not good. And we're the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak,
Yeah.
flapping around,
Yeah.
squawking.
The squeaky wheel gets the oil. I'm gonna be a squeaky wheel.
So moving on to
And we are at 4:30.
yeah, so we have about 10 more minutes left. We have 2 more sections to go through.
Okay.
So moving on to section 4, this was focusing on the economy, and throughout the section they kind of really focus on deconstructing the rule of law, and kind of making entities accountable to the American people. So kind of removing that expectation of like, if you do something illegal, you'll get repercussions for it. Now there is like a level of immunity to certain individuals when they commit crimes and such. So they do this by creating, in their words, a strong, impartial Department of Justice that's that upholds the core values of independence, impartiality, honesty, integrity, respect, and excellence. And they do this also through dismantling the perceived two-tier justice system. And yes, they focus also a lot on ending what they call partisan and ideologically driven prosecutions. So kind of blaming the two-party system for kind of some of the ways in which we have prosecuted individuals in the past. So I think this might apply to Flint in the way that if prosecutions against Rick Snyder had actually been carried through the way that they should have been, they would have called that a partisan, like a partisan choice or a partisan influenced decision to carry out charges against him. They talk a little bit more about corruption and making sure those structural changes emphasize the deconstruction of centralized administration, and really giving political appointees that decision-making power and centralizing power in their hands, whereas it being centralized in the people's hands. So if I could maybe give some more examples of that. This would be things like elimination of unions and worker protections. This would be things like ending civil rights and diversity, equity, and inclusion protections in government. This would be things like deregulating big business in the oil industry and giving them incentives to continue with things that promote climate change. And I believe this might also be defunding the FBI and Homeland Security, and using the military to break up domestic protests.
What?
So, like, returning some of that militarization back upon us.
Yeah.
No strikes.
Yeah, and I mean that is something I think we could speak to in a larger context with, again, the history of the labor movement, specifically right here in Flint.
That's right.
I
This
know,
is the birthplace of the auto industry, which set the pace for every wage in the nation.
and,
This is the birthplace.
right, and I think a specific instance in my mind that speaks to that, again, that is stated in Demolition Means Progress, is, for example, Charles Stewart Mott's influence and participation in that movement at that time, and kind of calling for the National Guard to come in and shoot the protesters in the sit-down strike of 1937. So this is, again, as we have all been saying, as Laura has been saying, this is a continuation of a decades century-long struggle against not influencing, but representing a power dynamic of the capitalists and the people and the doesn't matter, but yeah. So
I remember the National Guard was called in to
Yeah, they
shoot
were.
at
Yeah.
protesters in Kent State in 1974. And we have militarized the police. We actually have military equipment in municipal policing systems, tanks in Saginaw, for example. And
yeah.
one of the things that happened in the water crisis was that Flint, Michigan's downtown Saginaw Street was used as a military proving ground to train
Yes.
the military in how to curb urban insurrection. So, and they're building a cop city in Atlanta, Georgia right now, and in Gaylord, Michigan, which is the size of Chicago, in order to train the military in domestic insurrection. And so it's unprecedented to bring the military in, aside from foreign combat, to bring it into the actual cities and to regard citizens as a foreign enemy. And so this is very, very, very frightening in terms of historical precedent, and also where other regimes have turned on their own citizens and their own residents to quell any sort of dissension with some kind of ideology or rhetoric like Project 2025. So if you don't agree with Project 2025, you might have the military come in to quell your dissension.
So we only have about 5 more minutes left. So we'll get into the last section, section 5, which they focus on independent regulatory agencies. So when you think of that, you can think of the Department of Education, the EPA. I mean, the list really goes on. But I say those two first because they are the most pertinent to Flint. I think of them as the most pertinent to Flint. That could be conversations that the community has to like established level of importance. But to get into section 5 a little bit more, they state the objective basically to ensure independence and environmental stewardship. And through that definition, they say a combination of deregulation, promotion of fossil fuels, and selective environmental protection policies is what their goal is. So some key points through that, seeing what they mean a little bit more by that is gaining energy independence through increased production of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas, which have already been established by leading scientists, if you believe in science, to be the cause of climate change and to be the cause of kind of a lot of natural disasters that are kind of occurring at larger rates than years prior. And really deconstructing and dismantling agencies that have provided oversight and regulation on different aspects of life for Americans. So the big one I said earlier was the EPA. So they would like to, they say, reduction of regulatory burdens on the energy sector, particularly those imposed by the Environmental Protection Agency, streamlining environmental review processes, and limiting the scope of the National Environmental Policy Act. So basically that means getting rid of the EPA, making it so that the EPA is not an agency that really has any power to do anything, and kind of taking that power away and giving corporations free reign to do what they will to the environment for their profit margins. So they go a little bit more into detail. They talk about reevaluating the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act to reduce federal oversight and encourage state and local management. Really, again, what that means is giving corporations the say to do and act as they will, and taking away from the federal government's responsibility, because state and local wouldn't have the power, as much power as the federal government, to make sure oversight is being maintained and offer sanctions or punishment for things that go awry. If anybody has anything to say about that.
We cannot afford to get rid of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The operative word is protection. If you get rid of that, why do you think we're still suffering 10 years later with the water crisis? I went all the way to Washington, D.C. The head of the EPA didn't have a clue as to what really happened in Flint until the delegation went there. And when we told him, he sat there and cried because we had real life stories. We were not protected by them. If you allow 2025 to take all of our protections away, we're going to be diseased out, hurt, dying all over the place.
The EPA wasn't adequate to begin with. There weren't enough protections.
And
so
now they want to dismantle that.
removing protections is going to make it even worse. That is our point. Yeah.
So I think that's all the time that we have for today. This has been a great conversation, I think, and I hope that it has been generative for a lot of folks, and it helps them in understanding Project 2025. If maybe you could leave a comment, I know like we weren't able to respond in like a call-in type of way, but maybe if you leave comments, maybe it's something we can answer for next time, or maybe include like a different scope for next time. But we really thank you for participating with us and watching, and being.
Thanks to Out of the Mud Media Productions for hosting this. Thank you to Democracy Defense League and all of the members who always show up, who are always there. They've got our backs, and we're members as well. I don't know if they'd be open to it, but maybe we could have another podcast where there are invited guests, and maybe they'll even get a chance to speak this time. We kept inviting you, but you didn't want to say anything. So, but thank you very much, and we will see you next week, same time, 3:30 Wednesdays. Thank you. This is Beyond the Pale, signing off.
Beyond the Pale. Where do you get all this from?